Happy Monday, happy celebration. Maybe not a great eclipse we'll see today, but we're delighted to have y'all here today. My name's Matt Clark, and I'm co-chair of the Visiting Artists Committee, and we all want to welcome you here. We're delighted to have our second Visiting Artist of the Year, Gyun Hur, to provide some insights to her creative practice, her teaching practice, and we're just delighted to have her here to share her insights and her creativity and her artistic practice. Gyun Hur is an interdisciplinary artist and educator whose lived experience as a daughter of immigrants deeply fuels her practice. Born in South Korea, she moved to the U.S. state of Georgia at the age of 13 and currently lives and works in New York. Hur has participated in residencies with Stoveworks, NARS Foundation, Pratt Fine Arts Center, BRICworkspace, Danspace Project, Oxbow, Vermont Studio Center, and Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She is a recipient of a Bronx Museum AIM Fellowship, Foundation for Contemporary Arts Emergency Grant, Artadia Award, and the inaugural Hudgens Prize, among others. Her works have been featured in publications including Art America, Art Papers, Sculpture Magazine, Hyperallergic, Culture Magazine, The Cut, and Art Asia Pacific, among others. Her interest in art making in public space has led to the presentations at the TEDxCentennialWomen, the International Street Art Conference, The Living Walls, The City Speaks, the Atlanta Contemporary Arts Center, the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, the New School, and many others. Hur has contributed to fLoromancy, the Brooklyn Rail, and the Forgetory. Please help us give a warm Mavericks welcome to Gyun Hur.
Hi, it's really wonderful to be here. My name is Gyun Hur, and as remind me your name one more time. Matt has introduced me. I'm an interdisciplinary artist and an educator, and I'll be able to share a little bit more about my practice and how my thinking and making process has been evolving for the past years with you guys. And thank you for being here on such an incredible day as an eclipse is happening, solar eclipse. I want to thank Carrie Iverson, whom I met as a very young person in graduate school, and I was taking a class at Pilcher Glass, 2008, I believe. Yeah, so that's many, many years ago, and I was still forming as a person and as an artist, and she's invited me back and has been hosting. Thank you, and Jeremy, and also Justin for supporting kind of this ideations that I had around glass sculptures, and I've had an incredibly productive weekend making work along with my family being here with me, so that's been really meaningful. So I like to usually with the student body share the work in my senior year in my undergraduate school and also a graduate work, so I'm gonna share this and how this becomes a context for the rest of my practice. As my biography is shared, my family immigrated to state of Georgia when I was 13 years old. So I grew up in South Korea, and as a teenager living in state of Georgia, this kind of very particular experience as an immigrant daughter and feeling as if my story kind of got disrupted, right? With language and culture, really sort of created this relentless sense of longing and yearning. And I studied painting as an undergraduate student. So for my senior thesis, I really kind of poured out a lot of my energy and aspirations towards the idea of erecting this garden that I used to play as a child. So the photo that you're seeing, that's my grandmother's garden that I used to play in. But also this luscious garden that I remember as a child, I was probably only about 2.5, 3 years old. And it's my very first place of fantasy and play and imagination. And it's also a place that eventually turned brown and turned completely dead as my grandmother sold the house and the land to move into the city. That was happening in 80s. In South Korea. And I just remember, even as a very young person, feeling a deep sense of loss and feeling incredibly sad about losing a sense of a place in which I could play out imagination, right? So that idea of loss and yearning and longing continues to become a place of center for me. So that's the painting that I did. I haven't painted since, so that's kind of interesting. This is one of the class assignments that I did during my graduate studies. So now 2009, about 3 years later, we were assigned an assignment, right, in one of my sculpture classes. And this is a hand-shredded silk flowers. So I collected these silk flowers that you find from cemeteries, actually. And after rainy or windy day, they get plucked out. And I saw the cemetery when I visited for a school assignment, longer story later. They were dumping out these collected, discarded silk flowers in dumpster. And I got a permission from the cemetery office to basically collect them for 2 years during my graduate studies. So every month or so, I'll go and collect and gather these found, discarded silk flowers that's been abandoned. And then they were accumulating in my studio, and I decided to basically pluck these petals out and hand cut them until they become powder. And then I carefully lay them on the floor and re-replicated my mother's wedding blanket. And these are like a sand painting almost, right? There's no adhesive that's holding these materials. So the idea is a sense of vulnerability and fragility when you're trying to think about erecting or recreating things that's been lost in the past. And how also my sense of self and identity have felt incredibly fragile around the time that I was in school. I think being an art student is one of the incredible privileges to be able to sort out your story and try to make sense of who you are, right, through expressions. And that's exactly what I was doing, I think. And that became my thesis. After I graduated, now about, this was 2009. A year later, as I was graduating, I was able to then expand that language and way of working into gallery context and enlarge the scale. And with that, I also have needed a community to come together to help with the work, right? And then it got larger, so this is probably about 8 by 10 feet or so. And this is now 16 by 30 feet in public space, unfolding these hand-shredded silk flowers to replicate my mother's wedding blanket in a very public way. My parents were involved in the production of the work, and first decade of my work, I really wanted it to translate my immigrant experience and politics of labor. And a lot of the work that I was making, they were coming out of my hands with hours of labor, just shifting through these materials. And then visuals kind of evolved, and I worked a lot around the same material and process. I would hand shred silk flowers, and I've generated poetics of landscape in which I felt like I could be home, So 2 years later, is it 2 years later? I'm just trying to give a little bit of context. In the same year, I was trying to also make a different sort of poetics of a way that I was defining home. And oh, that's wrong, 2014, 3 years later, I also created a system of interiority where I'm actually starting to now then think about interior landscape. And then that being externalized through different materials in addition to hand-shredded silk flowers. So this is my first time using mirrors and also glass and lighting, dirt. So these kind of materials are kind of entering in. So I'm just giving these very old works to give you a little bit of context of where I am now. So that's 2014, a decade ago, right? And then I'll share now where I am and where I have been more recently as an artist. So this is an ongoing project that I started with photojournalist Dustin Chambers and titled Love Song. I actually lived in Hong Kong as an expat teaching at a university for 4 years. As an Asian American going back to Asia, but also Hong Kong that has a colonial context was very interesting for me because I got to sort of observe Asia in many different contexts as an Asian American in a very racialized way. And coming back to the States and going back to state of Georgia where I grew up and seeing my parents and my past life unfolding after a few years of being abroad felt so raw and very different because I also changed a lot, right? So I decided to collaborate with a photojournalist to basically document trinity of these places that sort of formed me and my parents' story as immigrant family, which is church, dry cleaners. My parents worked and owned the dry cleaners, and home. So this is my mother and her choir. They go to McDonald's after church is over, right? And this kind of siloed communities, visibility and invisibility, and the kind of lyricism that gets held amongst themselves. And this is the only place where my mother didn't really speak English, even though she lived here for 20-something years, that this was kind of the only place that she could be legible and she could sing out her sort of desires and brokenness, right? And I think as a daughter, I was really trying to think about how that gets translated in her life and how I can use that in a very vulnerable and honest way in my own work. And I started to generate writings in response to these images. A little bit of performances at the High Museum. I invited my old friends and mentors and mentees, and they sat down with me and we plucked the silk flowers together at a corner of a museum space, and we just kind of we were stationed for 7 days for folks to be able to kind of just, I guess, observe what's happening. And it was interesting as an Asian American femme body to be in public space to generate this sort of living sculpture and a spectacle. And it was a very intimate moment in that space, but then from a point of view of the public, the way that the public engaged with, you know, what's unfolding in front of their eyes varied very differently. So that's kind of one of the projects that I did. This is my nephew and niece who participated in the project as well. Ever since I become an auntie and also now a mother, I've been thinking a lot about generational work, healing work that I want to sort of participate. And one of the things that I really think a lot about is the idea of love and how that translates in the work that I make. And this quote by James Baldwin, and he wrote a letter to his nephew. And I'll read maybe an excerpt of it. Yes, it's okay. I'm gonna start right in the middle. As an uncle, he saw this nephew being born and he's expressing the sense of love that he's experiencing, right? To be loved, baby, hard at once and forever to strengthen you against the loveless world. Remember that. I know how black it looks today for you. It looked black that day too. Yes, we were trembling. We have not stopped the trembling yet. But if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And now you must survive because we love you and for the sake of your children and your children's children, right? And do you sense a sense of urgency and the kind of love that he really transpires to his nephew? And I think that really inspires me for me to really think about that my racialized experience also as an Asian American growing up in the South and how I want to translate that to my nephew and niece and my own daughter, right? So I'm going to now share a little bit about the project that I've been working on in the past few months, titled Our Mothers, Our Water, and Our Peace. In the past few months, I've been engaging with different organizations and individuals in Atlanta, Georgia, who gathered and formed alliance soon after, if you guys remember, the Atlanta spa shootings in 2021. It was during the pandemic, and it was also soon after the COVID and escalation of Asian hate crime, but prefaced of that is also George Floyd. A lot of things were happening around that time, if you remember. And because I grew up there, I think that event was incredibly personal, right? One of the spas was only 15 minutes from where my parents were living at that time. But collectively in Asian American community, it really shook us up. So I'm thinking a lot about the community that I grew up in, and also how my very biographical, insular somewhat, my practice can kind of expand with new kind of political consciousness that I haven't really claimed before as an artist. So I find that quite exciting for me. In the past few years, I've been working with river water and glass, actually, which I will talk a little bit more about that. And I think a lot about abstraction in my work as a strategy for the public to be able to have multiple entry points for them to kind of come into my work. Because in that abstraction and the landscape, that's where grief resides. And I'm talking about grief, we can all talk about grief in many different ways. It can be racialized grief, right? It can be grief of losing someone, literally, or losing a place of origin, losing a family of origin that you no longer feel as connected to. There are lots of losses that we experience as an individual and also as a community, right? So after a decade of hand shredding the silk flowers laboriously and relentlessly, I really transitioned now to accumulating these teardrop-shaped hand-blown glass vessels, and then I transfer local river wherever I show these vessels to formulate, I think about lyricism a lot, because as we grieve, for example, when I think about my grandmother and my mother, when they never talk about how they're grieving, they're not gonna be able to tell me I'm actually grieving because the context of my story is blood. They're not gonna be able to they're not gonna do that, right? But the way that they grieved was they sang. And I think about lyricism around that, and how many of us lean on to lyricism in ways for us to be able to grieve. So I'm gonna just move forward with the project. We're generating about 150 glass vessels for them to be installed amongst the Asian American communities and different organizations and individual homes. And then per site, we're generating workshops and gatherings, and that's happening this year. And I'll talk a little bit about titles. When I thought about in my title, Our Mothers, I'm specifically thinking about intergenerational matriarch and how complicated that is around love, grief and also class, right? And I think this proximity that I have to this particular event, I've been able to really process what it means for me to incite rage as well as grief. And now as a mother, and I have now, she's 17, 18 months old, and she's here with me. She's playing with her dad right now. But I've been thinking a lot, once again, what it means for me to leave something palpable for her to enter and trace our own story if she wants to, and for that to be legible, and for that to be something graspable for her, and that she will be able to understand her own matriarch with power, grace, and gentleness. Yeah. These are some of the questions that I'm asking as I'm doing this project. How have we arrived here? And what is the things that we are feeling, right? The weight that we are feeling. How do I hold you? And what kind of song are we singing? And how do we choose to remember our griefs and loves in this land? And the last question I've been really thinking a lot about is how do we convert the legacy of violence into poetic citation of agency? How do we think about gaining agency in the way in which I live, just more individually, but also as a community, right? Despite of it all, right? So this is also part of the research. It's called Socialgram, where we're looking into Atlanta organizations in which we can partner, but also the allianceship that formed and has been forming in the past few years, just to understand and honor the social support that's already happening within the community. And as an artist, for me to be able to kind of have this research as a backbone, for me to be anchored and to respect the community that raised me, has been incredibly inspiring. I'm going to transition now to take you to more of a personal work also that I've been doing in the past few years and how I'm landing. This is right before the COVID literally started. I did this really kind of interesting, at the corner of the art space, the vinyl of my grandmother's garden, and then hand-shredded silk flowers, yellow. And then often I title my work as if I'm writing a poem, so I wouldn't know any other way. And I did 3 days performance where I am in silence cutting the silk flowers for the public to view. I've been working with color yellow for some time. I think I've shared with some other folks in various moments that a lot of, especially I would have to say, Black artists and writers and musicians have really modeled a lot of other folks, communities of colors, how to think about our own stories. And in the 60s and 70s, this particular phrase of reframing our inheritance of color as a part of the racial talk, right? And for us to hear that Black actually is beautiful was a powerful way for me to receive that as a way for me to interpret my inheritance of also yellow as a way of how some of the Asian Americans have been defined historically, specifically in America, in context of its racial history. And I wanted it to reframe that, right? And to give an insight to poetics to that color and in my own work, in relationship to my skin, and also, once again, the racialized experience. 2021, this is my very first time where the glass and river water entered. During this time, I was also going through a very difficult personal loss, and I knew that I wanted it to bring river water into my work, and I didn't know how to. I spent a few days right by Delaware River water, soon after I lost someone really, really dear to me, and I didn't know what to do. And I walk up to this view every morning, and I saw the sun glistening to this river, and it's constantly moving. And I realized that it was teaching me the choreography of letting go. And it was so beautiful. And I wanted that to be part of my work, but again, I didn't know how to bring that into my work. And then, I went to river water to gather the water, and then I'm like, what do I do? And I was taking a walk and doing some research. So, two things. This object is a Victorian object called lacquer motori, and when a widow loses someone and she's grieving, the idea is that she collects tears into this beautiful glass object called lacquer motori. And when tears all evaporate, then your period of grieving is over. And I found that so beautiful. So I'm gonna also, and then also Kiki Smith and Fred Wilson, they have worked in glass and very specific teardrop shapes. And so I definitely also had that as my reference. So I thought, okay, teardrop shapes, I'm gonna transfer water as literal as it can be, but it felt very accessible, and it was articulating and meeting the needs that I wanted to deliver in my work. Since then, I've been generating different variations of these vessels. And this is soon after the spa shooting. In response to that, I wanted it to honor what we call them as victims, the aunties, right, who passed away during the spa shooting, but I almost saw them as saints, as if they have crossed the river, looking back to us, letting us know that, they're watching over us. And this phrase actually comes from the hymnal. And this is part of the bigger show that I had. And I started to fuse the black into the yellow glass vessels to think about also intersectional way that we can think about racialized experience in America that, yeah, okay, but then it's not just my story here, right? And how do we talk about that? And I know that it's a very literal translation for me to say, okay, let's bring some of these colors in, right? But one thing that I really love about as an artist, that I can make aesthetic and formalistic choices for me to say, it's really beautiful when you think about it, but then underneath it that I am implying some of these messages around intersectional racialized experiences, and also again, lyricism. So continual sort of this was, we just had a very first site-specific installation of Our Mothers, Our Water, and Our Peace at Asian American Advancing Justice Office in Atlanta. And as a community, we install the vessels together. We fill the water together, and we hung the vessels together as a community. And it was such a moving experience, actually. So that's my vessels. And I also want to talk a little bit about my relationship of my own body and how I think about the glass work. So Anna Mendieta and Janine and Tony are huge inspirations of mine. These are women artists who also immigrated to the States, and they're utilizing their bodies as a site of trauma, but then also as agency and a place where life generates, right? So a few years ago, I just wanted to make something where I'm holding on to something that's impossible. I'm holding on to something that's leaving me, and how do I do this? And so I created clay slabs, and this is in my studio, trying out different things, but I basically just kind of smeared my body, upper body, as if I'm holding on to something and just leaving the bodily imprints, right, of that yearning as a material. And then what we did was we casted it in glass and shifted a little bit of the yellow again because I've been working with it for some time now. And that sculpture has held river water, and this time also breast milk as I'm nursing my baby. And I just really wanted, and this series is, well, I'm hoping to continue to make series of it as my body evolves in the next 10 or 15, 20 years or so, just to create a kind of a larger body of work that holds imprints and history of my body and my yearnings that changes over time, right? So that's kind of one of my most recent work that feels very personal to me. And I've been wanting to do this for a long time, where I'm leaving imprints of my knees. I've been thinking a lot about gestures of kneeling in supplication and submission. And we can think about it in context of spirituality, racial experience. There are many different contexts in which you can imagine the position of kneeling. And for me, it's interesting for me to think about how Christianity ended in my family post-Korean War as missionization was happening. And I find it kind of ironic and violent how missionization post-Korean War, in the midst of the trauma that was happening, that the idea of healing also came from the West as a rescue. I don't know. So I find that sometimes, even though I grew up with it, I wrestle with that a lot. But that's how I also grew up learning what healing is supposed to sound like and feel like, and the gestures of that. So these are some images of elders in Korean churches, like praying. And I grew up seeing my elders do that. I've done that also in my youth. And I'm just like trying to process that, right? Because I've seen my grandmother. I woke up in the middle of the night hearing my grandmother on her knees praying for each of her grandchild. I've seen my mom. She's still going to morning prayer. I grew up doing that. I don't do that anymore, but I think about that, right? But that's only one dimension of kneeling that I'm thinking about, but there are so many other things that I'm thinking about as well. So this past Friday, Jeremy and Justin prepared these incredible boxes of sand, and I got to, in a more private way, spend some time thinking about this and put my knees against this sand. And then also like some of my upper bodies as well, as I think about prayer and submission and supplication, all of that. And then we carbonized it, and that looks really beautiful. They poured glass over it. And Jeremy just sent me this morning the images of the glass that just came out of the kiln this morning, so I'll be able to go and see it later today. So we'll see, you know, I'm so excited to see that. And the next day, we generated vessels, but in a larger size. So it's my first time actually doing vessels this big for the first time, and that was really incredibly exciting to see. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Aubrey, if they are here. So I just want to take a moment to, oh, it's 35, so I'm going to end like in a minute. And I just want to open up the space for you guys to ask me questions or respond if you can be brave enough. And so I'll end it in a minute so that it doesn't last too long. Because, yeah. So Yi Wei and Evan Bobo, they're husband and wife team, but Yi really has been the person who's been generating the vessels for me. I'm not a glass artist, so I just want to kind of acknowledge and then just kind of talk about the way that I'm thinking about what it means for me to be an artist that has now transitioned, right? My first 10, 15 years of my work is I was like hand shredding. Everything is coming out of my hands, right? With glass work, my hands are not involved other than sketches and maybe installing the work, right? I have these amazing glass artists doing the work of fabricating the vessels, right? And what does that mean for that labor of production of making work being transferred, especially as an immigrant daughter where politics of labor has been important to me. And this access to privilege that feels like to me has been something that I've been thinking about a lot. But again, when I think about power and agency, I want to be able to enter to that space of being able to claim that and say, I'll continue to make the work that feels right for me, right? But anyway, so that's the process of making the vessels. And then this is Justin, Jeremy, and Aubrey making these like bigger vessels that just came out this morning. So we'll see how it goes. But again, this is the last slide. And I just really want to thank you guys for hosting me and also allowing me to pitch ideas like this and just generating the works. And I really appreciate that so much. So, and thank you guys for listening. That's all. Thank you. Great. So right now it's 10:36. I know that the class ends around 10:50 or so. You have made yourself open enough to hear me out. And if any of you guys feel brave enough to say anything or ask me anything, feel free to do so. Yes, hi, what's your name? Joey. Joey? Hi.
So your work has a lot of like, your pieces have a lot of meaning behind them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What, what's your thought process?
Yeah.
At the same time, the work is like very, aesthetically pleasing to look at.
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful artwork.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is like, how hard is it to kind of bridge? How hard is it to, have that thing that you really want, that message you really want to convey, or that thing that the source of your work will also making it look nice? Is it hard for it to, look nice first? Or you think of the aesthetic first, or you kind of think of the meaning behind it first?
Yeah. Remind me your name one more time.
Joey.
Joey, that's such a great question, actually. Are you also an art student? Kinda. What do you do? Graphic design. So yeah, it's all about communication, right? And how you want to have your message out to the public through the design that you're making, right? Especially if you want to embed message that feels really important to you, right? So it's the same. We're thinking and wrestling about the same thing, okay? So that's such a great question. Actually, someone also asked me when I did a talk a few weeks ago, how do you feel about when you're talking about something so difficult at times and racially charged and it can be controversial, and you make such beautiful work, and how do you reconcile with that, I think as an artist, as you're forming as an artist, you are going to continue to articulate, and there are gonna be preferences and things that you just love as an artist and as a designer. If you like blue, you like blue. There needs to be no justification around that. So any sort of sensual, intuitive way of making the work and say I just like, figures and I love working with huge contrast, then continue to articulate and develop that with no need of justification around it. Does that make sense? And as you do that though, I think internally you're gonna continue to wrestle, and also out in the world, you're gonna continue to wrestle with the identity that you bring. Right? And then you're gonna have to find a way how they lend each other. So my answer is, I don't think I have compromised my aesthetics and my preferences and my love towards color and forms and materials. So I allow myself to have joy in that, and I really love thinking about yellow, and I love thinking about light, and I love thinking about space that feels so poetic. To me, that's really, really important because I want to be able to enjoy that too and feel at home, right? But then I also use beauty as strategy, where people feel like they're being invited to come and they get to oh, if they spend the time and read a little bit if they want to, that they'll be able to discover the layers around that. So I don't know if I answer your question directly, but it's a process. Yeah, don't compromise anything, and it will meet. It will meet. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Anyone else?
How do you keep the water clean?
How do I keep the water clean? And then I saw you, and then I saw you, Justin. Water, so I'm gaining knowledge around river water. You guys, the river water or water around us is very polluted. They're not doing well, as we all know, right? So we filter it and we boil it so that the water is like somewhat purified. It's something that I want to get into more as around sanitation. But water still has a little bit of residue and it evaporates over time and it leaves traces in the glass vessels and it becomes part of the work. So yeah, so water once like maybe, usually the show is up for like 6 to 8 weeks. And water evaporates and sediments of the water gets built up at the bottom a little bit. And then I just leave it as it is. And then we clean it after the show is over. We clean the vessels. Yeah. Hi. What's your name?
Giselle.
Giselle. Are you also an art student?
Yes, I'm a design student.
Okay. Hi.
So I was wondering, I noticed the ongoing pattern in your works, which was the use of the color yellow. Is it just like your favorite color, or is it like the key behind the...
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I've been using yellow so when I came back from Hong Kong in 2017, that 4 years of, again, being abroad was very informative as far as the way that I see myself. And I started reading this book that my graduate professor gave it to me, but as a young person, I was just like, why are you giving this to me? And it was titled Yellow. It's an older Asian American book around literature around the identity. And so I received it as a very young person. I read a few pages and I'm like, why does he want me to read Yellow because I'm Asian American? I felt a little bit offended and I didn't have capacity to process it then. And when I came back, I'm like, oh, I think I really need to go back and read that. So I spent the first few months really reading the book called Yellow, and I decided to really receive the historical context in which I am in as an Asian American, right? And yellow, again, as a racialized sort of term, right? Around Asian American sort of identity and the skin, in relation to other folks. So that's why I've been using it. And I don't know, I don't have any desire to go to another color yet. It seems like it just needs to continue to come out of me, so I'm just letting it. And I've been doing it since 2017, so it's been a minute. Yeah, great question, thank you. Justin, oh, I see you. Okay, so Justin, I see you, and I see you, yeah. Yeah.
It might be premature, but I'm curious on the happenstance of how you're thinking about the glass vessels, the gestural actions in the sand, that those were done in artillery shell boxes, like the funked artillery shell boxes.
I know.
Maybe it's too soon, but what was your kind of response to that, I guess?
I think that's kind of my autobiographical frame anyway. Something that I've been thinking a lot about is Korean War really framed the history of North and South Korea. There's a demilitarized zone that these Western political leaders decided to just kind of draw the line to pause the war, which it's happening even, it's not it's stopped happening ever since, so much violence took place, right? So the peninsula is divided up ever since then, right? So that sort of violence around war and trauma frames my family history, So for my body to be in that, and then that artillery box, which was coincidental, right? To hold that doesn't feel too far outside of what I've been already thinking. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah. So thank you for that question. Yeah. Yeah. Who was? Yeah. Hi. What's your name?
Victoria.
Victoria. Are you also an art student?
No, I'm actually a nursing major.
That's amazing. You're doing healing work for the community. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. What's your question?
So we were talking about how with the river water you aren't able to fully sanitize it, and so after the show, there's this sediment that's kind of left in the glass. And I know that earlier we were also talking about the lacrimal vestibules, where they would collect them, and then as they evaporated,
Yeah.
it signified like the ending of the grief.
Mhm.
Period.
Yeah.
Do you think with the evaporation of the water in your glass structures, the sediment that's left behind kind of can symbolize the trauma or that's left behind even
Yeah.
after the supposed grief period?
That's such a beautiful interpretation. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for a beautiful. You see the word. Even through just the images, right? That you're responding in a way that it's like such a dream as an artist for the audience to be able to see that and give meaning to that, right? And if that's how you see it, then absolutely. I do think that with the residues of whatever that gets left behind, like healing doesn't mean that like, oh, like I get baptized and I'm all of a sudden like completely fine. Like, no, like trauma is like in your body through generations. We know this, right? We know this. You have your grandmothers and your mothers and people who came before you. As much of the power that they have given you, you also carry their traumas with you as well. But then I feel that it's one of my generation, for the first time perhaps in my own matriarch, that I have literacy and agency and privilege to be able to sort that out a little bit. And I'm doing that seriously so that my daughter feels a little lighter. I want her to feel a little lighter than I do, So that residue, but she's gonna still feel a bit because I'm not gonna be fully healed during my lifetime, So that residue, you're exactly right. Yeah. Hi. What's your name?
My name is Dalen.
Dela?
Dalen.
Dalen. Is that right? Okay. Hi. Are you also an art student?
And our comedian.
Okay. Beautiful.
But I was just wondering if you would ever do a painting again, or if you're working on
That's such a great question. I think about that all the time because as an undergrad student, that was my love. It was like my first love. So maybe one day, I do want to revisit. When I see my daughter and, I paint with her, but when I see my daughter and my husband kind of playing sometimes, I really want to draw and paint the moment in the most figurative way. Because I've been working in abstractions a lot. Even though I think about people in my work, they're all underneath of the abstraction, and I would love to be able to bring forth the most legible figures in my work, but maybe we'll see. I have no idea. Yeah, thank you for asking the question. Yeah. Yes, hi. Yes.
Hi, I'm Christina.
Christina.
The grad student in
Okay.
media. I'm curious about, you have, it seems, several sort of long-term projects that are kind of ongoing and communally driven, and then you also have these more personal sort of pieces that they're all related, but
Yeah.
do you feel like you have sort of a way of managing these sort of longer-term communal projects and then making time for smaller, more personal things, or is it just sort of it goes how it goes and just sort of let that flow, or just curious how you?
Yeah, I have a lot of Excel sheets. Lots of Excel sheets. Management, all of these things take a lot of effort, and it's something that I only started to figure out as an adult only recently. So I would say until recently it all felt blur, and I just kind of did it.
And then you had a baby.
Yeah, and I had a baby, and then I realized that I need to organize seriously, and if I don't, I'm gonna drop balls a lot, like in many opportunities. So now I am very intentional, where I'm thinking about community-based projects, and I know that they have to be a long term. I can't do it in a year or two. Like, I need to think about it in long term for sustainability, for devotion, respect, but also my way of my availability, right? Shorter times that feels more personal. I have to be intentional carving that out in my life. Unless I do that, I'm not gonna have an opportunity, you know? So yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah. Maybe one or two more questions. I know time is almost up. It's 10:50 at the moment. I see you, and then you have one more question. Yeah? Okay. All right. Hi.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm a grad student.
Okay.
And I'm curious about the choice to clean the vessels out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you're leaving that sediment and it's representing kind of the trauma, why not let it build up as you
That's so beautiful. For sanitary reason also, and then also transparency. But even when clean it out though, some of the lines that gets created from water being held for some time, we can't really we can't clean it that well actually. So, because I only have one hole. Yeah, so some still gets left, and I initially wanted to clean everything out, and someone told me, actually my assistant, who's my former student, told me, I think you're gonna have to kind of embrace this as part of the process, and that's when I really thought about that. So
They each become very individual that way too.
Yeah.
Like even more than they already are. So,
right, and it's got history, right? Yeah, exactly. Yes, hi Dre.
Okay, so I know you're open to interpretations.
Yes.
You can just kind of interpret it.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. But have you ever been in a situation where it was just something so almost just strange, you were just like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let me give you an example. That's a great question, and I think it's an important question also as I think a person of color, artist of color, because we all carry different sort of projections and interpretations, and also how our ideas and perspectives have been formed that it's no, that's not what I meant, but people can't help but to kind of use existing references, But anyway, this was one of the experiences. First 2 days, I wasn't allowed to have a written statement about the work, which I felt was really necessary. But then my collaborator who commissioned me to be there, so I didn't have any explanation. And then the choreographer brought someone to, and I'm in silence because I'm not speaking during my performance. I'm plucking the flowers on the floor, And then she mentioned I heard her talking about this performance being a really joyful, yellow is really joyful, and it's beautiful, and the artist experience, exploring joy. And yes, okay, partially, but then as I'm in silence, plucking the flowers like this for hours, I'm that's not, no, I told you that I'm thinking about my racial experience here in relationship to yellow, and she didn't hear me, and that wasn't the way that she was able to explain the work. And that's such an essential core of my work. So I felt really misunderstood at that moment. So I had to take a moment to I call a few friends to talk about it. And then I wrote an email, right? I looked at it again and again so that it sounds like it communicates to the person. And then I sent it. The next day, she sat right by me and apologized, and she protected the work, and she tended to the work in a very different way after that. So if that happens, and if you feel even though you're open to interpretation, if you feel you need to speak to it, do so. But then you also want to think about self-preservation as well, that you don't want to spend too much emotional labor trying to justify or explain way too much of yourself either in the world. Because you should just be able to be you, right? Yeah. Okay, that's it. Thank you guys.
Thank you.